There is a version of the Nancy Guthrie case that most people are following right now. A stranger identified an elderly woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood in Tucson. He studied her home. He purchased basic equipment from a big box store. He arrived in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, disabled her doorbell camera, entered through an unlocked back door, and took her. That is the story the headlines are built around. That is the framework most of the public conversation has settled into. But underneath that framework, there is another set of questions. Questions that investigators have been quietly pursuing since the first days of this case. Questions that do not fit cleanly into the stranger narrative. Questions about timelines that do not fully add up. About knowledge of the home that a stranger could not easily possess. About investigative decisions that only make sense if law enforcement is looking very carefully at people who are not strangers at all. This video is not an accusation. Every individual referenced here is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. What this video is an honest accounting of the documented evidence, the verified investigative actions, and the questions that the evidence raises, presented with the same seriousness and rigor that this case demands. This is the verdict room. We examine the evidence, we follow the facts, and at the end of every investigation, we deliver the verdict. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we go further than the headlines, bringing you the forensic detail, the investigative analysis, and the documented evidence that changes the way you understand these cases. If you are already part of this community, hit that like button. It helps more people find investigations like this one. Cases that deserve serious analysis. Cases that deserve answers. Now let us look at what the evidence actually shows. Before anything else, we need to establish who this investigation is about at its center. Because no matter how deeply we go into timelines and forensic details and investigative patterns, we cannot lose sight of the fact that Nancy Guthrie is a real person who has been missing since the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. She has a family that loves her. She has grandchildren who are waiting for her to come home. She has a daughter who goes to work every day, carrying a weight that is visible to anyone paying attention. Nancy Guthrie is not a puzzle to be solved. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman who spent decades building a life in the Tucson community she loved. That is the reason this investigation matters. That is the reason every question in this video is worth asking. Now let us talk about what the evidence shows. 9 days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, a video appeared on the Ring Neighbors app in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. A man, late at night, walking backward up a residential driveway. Not stumbling, not disoriented. Walking backward with deliberate, measured steps. Keeping his back flat toward the camera, his chin tucked to his chest. Maintaining that orientation even as a dog barked and he needed to retreat. To understand why walking backward matters in this context, you need to understand how consumer security cameras work. Devices like Ring and Nest do not record continuously around the clock. They sleep. They rely on passive infrared sensors to detect body heat and motion. When someone steps into the frame, the sensor has to wake the processor. The lens adjusts to low light. The connection to the server is established. That process takes 1 to 2 seconds. If you walk forward toward a camera, that first second captures your face as you approach. But if you walk backward, the critical wake-up seconds capture nothing but the back of a jacket and a backpack. By the time the lens is fully processing, the face is already shielded. This is not random behavior. This is someone who understands how the technology works. Someone who thought about camera lag time specifically enough to use their own body as a countermeasure. And the backpack visible in that January 23rd footage is, by visual identification, consistent with the Ozark Trail 25-liter hiker pack with distinct reflective safety strips. The same backpack documented at Nancy Guthrie's home 9 days later. Same bag, different location, 6.5 miles apart. In forensic geography, investigators call the January 23rd location a buffer zone, far enough from the target to avoid any immediate connection if something goes wrong, close enough to replicate the exact environment. Both locations are in the Catalina foothills. Both feature isolated properties with long approaches. Both are subject to the same dark sky ordinances that produce minimal street lighting and deep pools of shadow after midnight. He was not selecting a random location. He was selecting a simulator, a practice environment with the same physical characteristics as the actual target. And when a dog barked, He fled, but he maintained his backward orientation even while retreating. He suppressed what would be the natural biological reflex to turn toward a sound. He would rather navigate a retreat in reverse than give the camera a single frame of his face. That level of discipline in a moment of alarm does not come from panic. It comes from preparation, from having already decided before arriving exactly what behavior to maintain regardless of what happened. Now compare that man to the man who appeared on Nancy Guthrie's porch 9 days later. On January 23rd, the individual is hunched, careful, paranoid about every pixel. On February 1st, he is not walking backward anymore. He is walking forward. He is calm. He approaches the front door with a level of deliberate composure that is, by any behavioral analysis, striking. And then he does something that becomes one of the most discussed details in the entire footage. He reaches out and taps the camera lens, twice. A rhythmic, casual gesture. The kind of physical interaction with an object that implies familiarity rather than tension. 9 days earlier, he was so concerned about being captured on camera that he navigated an entire driveway in reverse to avoid it. 9 days later, he is touching the camera directly. What changed? The most analytically compelling explanation is that the January 23rd event was a test. After conducting it, he monitored the Ring Neighbors platform for the area. He saw that the footage was posted. He saw that no one identified him. He learned, not from luck but from direct feedback, that his disguise was effective. The community's own alert network became, in effect, a validation mechanism. It told him that he was invisible, and that confirmation is what produced the composure visible on Nancy's porch 9 days later. He arrived not as someone testing whether he could do this. He arrived as someone who had already confirmed he could. Now we need to talk about two people whose names have been central to the investigative conversation around this case. And we need to do that with the care the situation demands, because what we are discussing is documented investigative interest, not guilt, not accusation, not a conclusion. Annie Guthrie is Nancy's oldest daughter. She is a poet and a jeweler who works at the University of Arizona Poetry Center. She lives in Tucson, approximately 4 miles from her mother's home in the Catalina foothills. By every public account, her relationship with her mother was close and loving. She was present at family gatherings, including the dinner on the evening of January 31st, the night before Nancy disappeared. Tommaso Cioni is Annie's husband. He is a science teacher who has taught advanced placement biology at a charter school in Tucson for over 15 years. He was born in a small town in Tuscany and moved to Arizona in 2006. He plays bass in a local band. He is, by every public description, a quiet person living a quiet life. He also had dinner at Annie's house on the evening of January 31st, making him one of the people in the last documented social gathering Nancy Guthrie attended before she vanished. Here is the first detail that investigators have needed to establish with certainty, and that has not been resolved cleanly in the public record. Who was the last person to physically see Nancy Guthrie alive? Reporting on this question has produced conflicting accounts. Some sources say Tommaso drove Nancy home and confirmed she was safely inside at approximately 9:50 p.m. Other sources say Annie drove her home. Others describe both of them being involved in some capacity. The account has shifted depending on who is reporting it and when. In a case where every minute of the timeline matters, the fact that a consistent, confirmed answer to this foundational question has not been established publicly is not a trivial detail. It is a foundational one. Nancy's doorbell camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. If the 9:50 p.m. drop-off is accurate, that leaves a gap of nearly 4 hours between when Nancy was last confirmed inside her home and when the documented intrusion began. 4 hours is, by any operational assessment, sufficient time to depart, allow the neighborhood to settle into sleep, prepare, return, and execute. And critically, no confirmed public alibi for either Annie or Tommaso during that window has been disclosed. Now let us examine what investigators actually did in the weeks following Nancy's disappearance, because investigative actions speak as clearly as any statement. Investigators searched Annie and Tommaso's home multiple times. They documented rooms. They removed security cameras from the property. And in one of the most operationally specific details to emerge from reporting on this case, investigators were documented examining the septic system at the property, probing it with equipment in a way that multiple reporters on the scene captured on camera. That is a documented investigative action, and it carries meaning that does not require interpretation. You do not search a septic system in the course of a standard investigation. You search it when you believe it may have been used to conceal or destroy something. Annie Guthrie's vehicle was also impounded as part of the investigation. This was reported by Ashley Banfield of News Nation, citing a source she described as credible and closely connected to the investigative process. The sheriff's office subsequently described the impoundment as standard investigative practice. But in the context of a missing persons case being investigated as a potential kidnapping, the decision to impound a family member's vehicle carries specific implications. Vehicles are impounded when investigators believe they may have been used in the commission of a crime, or when forensic examination of the vehicle may produce relevant evidence. What was found or not found in that vehicle has not been disclosed publicly. Investigators also returned to Annie and Tommaso's property for what was reported as at least 5 separate visits. Neighbors were interviewed specifically about the couple, about what they were like, about their routines, about their relationship with Nancy. Reporter Brian Anton, who has maintained a sustained presence on the ground in Tucson since the earliest days of this case, reported that Tommaso had not been publicly seen for an extended period. Both Annie and Tommaso went largely silent publicly after the first week, which, depending on how you read it, could reflect the natural, overwhelming grief of a family in crisis, or something else entirely. None of this constitutes evidence of guilt. Every action described here has an innocent explanation available. Searches of a family's property can be thorough investigative due diligence. Vehicle impoundment can be standard procedure applied broadly. Public silence can be the recommendation of attorneys managing a family through an impossibly difficult situation. These things are true, and they are also true alongside the documented fact that trained federal investigators made repeated, resource-intensive decisions to go back to that property, to examine that septic system, to impound that vehicle, and to interview those neighbors specifically about this couple. Investigators do not allocate those resources without a basis for doing so. Before we go further into the investigative details, there is one more element of the January 23rd footage that deserves careful attention, because it contains something that has been discussed in certain analytical circles but has not received the mainstream attention it warrants. The individual in the footage holds a small flashlight in his mouth while working at the camera, not in his hand, not clipped to any equipment, between his teeth, pointed forward, leaving both hands free. This is an occupation-specific behavior. It is not a behavior you learn casually or adopt instinctively. It is the behavior of someone whose body has learned, through years of repetition in a specific context, that when both hands are needed and there is no surface to set a light on, the mouth is the solution. Electricians learn this working inside wall cavities. Plumbers learn it under floor joists. HVAC technicians, general contractors, anyone who spends years working in tight spaces with inadequate overhead lighting develops this habit so deeply that it becomes reflexive, not a choice made in the moment, but a default behavior the body executes without conscious decision. Former homicide detective David Lyons, who reviewed the footage publicly, identified this behavior specifically and noted the population it points toward. Trades workers, people who work with their hands in environments where a hands-free light source is a daily operational necessity. This detail connects directly to the investigative inquiries that investigators have reportedly made in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. Specifically, questions about construction workers at nearby properties, about contractors who had been working in the area in the months before the disappearance, about anyone with professional access to the neighborhood who would have had a reason to be present on the streets around Nancy Guthrie's home during the weeks that preceded February 1st. A person with professional access to a neighborhood has something that no casual observer has: a categorical shield. A truck parked on a residential street while work is being done nearby is not suspicious. It is expected. The brain of every passing driver or neighbor checking a ring notification categorizes it as background, irrelevant, ordinary, not worth a second look. If someone used professional access to conduct reconnaissance, to learn the road, to note the security installations, to build familiarity with the neighborhood's patterns and rhythms, they did all of that in plain sight, visible to everyone, noticed by no one. Now let us examine the question of what the person on Nancy's porch knew, and what that knowledge implies about who they are. Body language analysts and former federal investigators who reviewed the porch footage have noted a consistent observation. The individual does not move through that space like a stranger. He approaches the camera directly, without the moment of orientation that characterizes a person encountering an unfamiliar installation. He moves with what behavioral analysts describe as ownership posture, the subconscious physical confidence of someone who has been in a space many times before and does not have to think consciously about how to navigate it. He knew where the camera was before he arrived. He knew the position of the plant he used to briefly obscure the lens. He knew the layout of the porch. And according to Sheriff Nanos's public statements, the intruder demonstrated knowledge of the interior camera system at the property, including, critically, the fact that Nancy did not have active subscriptions for the additional Nest cameras inside the home. That is not information available from a satellite image or a street view search. That is information you get from being inside the home, from having conversations about the camera system, from hearing someone mention that they did not want to pay for the monthly subscription. It is the kind of information that circulates between family members and people close enough to be treated as family. Tommaso Cioni had been walking through Nancy Guthrie's front door for nearly 2 decades. He had helped with errands. He and Annie had assisted with property matters. He knew the home not as a location, but as a place he had been in hundreds of times. If there is any person whose subconscious familiarity with that porch, that front door, that camera placement would produce the behavioral pattern captured in that footage, it is someone with that kind of accumulated physical history in the space. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about what the behavioral evidence suggests and who, by documented history, fits the profile it describes. Now we need to address the gear. Because the equipment visible on the suspect in the porch footage is, by any professional assessment, poorly chosen and improperly used. A ski mask suitable for cold weather conditions, not typical Tucson January equipment. Basic nitrile gloves, a backpack from a major big box retailer with highly reflective safety strips that light up under infrared recording. A holster worn in a way that former law enforcement analysts publicly described as inconsistent with any tactical training. The total cost of the visible equipment is estimated at well under $100. The obvious read on this gear is incompetence. A person who did not know what they were doing. Someone who grabbed items quickly without thinking about how they would appear on camera or how professional operatives actually equip themselves. But there is another read, and it is worth sitting with. If you are an intelligent person, someone with professional training in analytical and scientific thinking, and you are planning an operation that you need traced back to a stranger rather than to yourself, what is the most effective misdirection you can create? You create a character. You perform a role. You purchase gear that is deliberately inconsistent with your actual profile. You wear the holster wrong. You buy the backpack with the reflective strips. You choose equipment that says to any profiler reviewing the footage, "This is not an educated, methodical person. This is someone impulsive, unskilled, operating on instinct." And then you walk out of that house with the same level of cognitive discipline that produced the backward walk on January 23rd. This concept, the deliberate performance of incompetence to redirect investigative attention, requires the kind of analytical thinking that is, by professional definition, the daily work of an advanced placement science educator. You have to understand cause and effect at a systems level. You have to model how the output of your actions will be interpreted by observers who do not know you are performing. You have to run the scenario backward from the investigative conclusion you want them to reach. The nitrile gloves are worth specific attention in this context. Nitrile examination gloves are standard equipment in biology laboratories. They are used when handling specimens, chemicals, and biological material. A biology teacher who runs regular laboratory sessions has a completely ordinary, unremarkable reason to have nitrile gloves accessible at home. Their presence in a household associated with laboratory work would raise no flags at all. The ordinariness of the gloves in that context is precisely what makes them a forensically interesting choice for someone trying to avoid leaving identifiable evidence. Now let us address the DNA evidence directly, because it is the element that will ultimately determine what happened. Sheriff Nanos publicly confirmed that DNA was recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's property. DNA that does not match Nancy herself and does not match anyone in close regular contact with her. Reporting on the investigation has also indicated that DNA was recovered from gloves found approximately 2 miles from the home along what investigators believe may have been an exit route. According to reporting, these two DNA profiles do not match each other. 2 separate DNA profiles, 2 separate locations, neither matching family members or close contacts, neither matching anyone in the law enforcement DNA database at the time of the most recent confirmed reporting. 2 profiles, 2 people. If that reporting is accurate, then the person who left DNA inside Nancy's home and the person who left DNA inside that glove are not the same individual, which means this investigation may not be looking for a single actor. It may be looking for an architect and an operative, one who planned and directed, one who executed. In that framework, the question of whether any specific individual's DNA was found at the scene becomes less important than it might initially appear. If someone planned and directed an operation but was not physically present during the execution, their DNA would not be at the location. Their absence from the forensic evidence would not be exculpatory. It would simply reflect their role. The sheriff publicly cleared the Guthrie family as suspects in the investigation. He said they had cooperated fully, providing phones, computers, vehicles, and access to their properties. He said they should be treated as victims. It is important to understand what that clearance means procedurally and what it does not mean. Cleared in an active investigation means that the current evidence does not support charging specific individuals at this time. It is not a finding of factual innocence. It is an investigative status. And in high-profile cases, publicly clearing individuals who remain of interest can serve a specific tactical function. It removes media pressure. It allows investigators to continue working without those individuals being surrounded by cameras, and it can produce the kind of behavioral relaxation that leads someone who has been careful to make a mistake they would not have made under direct scrutiny. The sheriff's clearance is a documented investigative action. So is returning to the same property 5 or more times, examining the septic system, and impounding the vehicle. Both things are true simultaneously. Understanding which of them is more operationally significant is a question the ongoing investigation will eventually answer. Now let us examine the ransom communications, because they present one of the most analytically interesting dimensions of this entire case. The ransom demands in the Nancy Guthrie case were communicated to media organizations, not directly to the family. A professional kidnapping operation communicates directly with the family, maintains a private negotiation channel, and avoids involving the press entirely. The goal of a ransom demand is payment, and payment requires a controlled private pathway from family to kidnappers. Involving the media introduces variables that an experienced criminal enterprise would not risk. But there is a different scenario in which communicating to the media makes operational sense. If the goal of the ransom communication is not actually to collect money, if the goal is to create the appearance of a financially motivated stranger abduction, then going to the media is exactly what you do. Every headline about a mysterious kidnapper demanding Bitcoin is another layer of narrative distance between the actual situation and the investigative framework being applied to it. The ransom demand was for $6 million in Bitcoin. That number is analytically interesting. It is not a round number. It is not an arbitrary figure. It is a number that reflects specific knowledge of the financial architecture of the Guthrie family. Knowledge of what Savannah Guthrie earns, what she could plausibly access, what a believable demand from someone targeting her family would look like. That number was not generated by someone with no knowledge of this family. It was generated by someone who had done research specific to this family's financial situation. There is a dimension of the timing of Nancy's disappearance that has not received sufficient analytical attention. Nancy was taken on the exact weekend that Savannah Guthrie was scheduled to travel internationally for NBC's coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics. Olympic coverage assignments are not decided spontaneously. They are determined weeks or months in advance, through complex logistical planning that involves travel arrangements, production scheduling, international credentials, and accommodation coordination. Savannah's assignment would have been known to her professional circle, her social circle, and by extension, anyone within the extended network of people who interacted with the Guthrie family in any personal or professional capacity. Someone who knew about that travel commitment would understand precisely what vulnerability window it created. Savannah would be internationally located. Her ability to respond quickly and decisively to any emergency involving her mother would be compromised by both the physical distance and the professional obligation of a live broadcast commitment. The person most likely to mobilize resources and attention on Nancy's behalf with maximum speed would be at the moment of maximum need on another continent. The precision of this timing, landing on the specific weekend of Savannah's departure, is the kind of coincidence that investigators in active cases treat with the scrutiny proportional to its specificity. Coincidences happen. Coincidences that align precisely with the vulnerability windows created by the private scheduling decisions of a prominent family member invite a different kind of attention. And the specific knowledge required to identify that window is not publicly available. Savannah's Olympic assignment may have been generally known. The specific departure weekend, the specific window of maximum vulnerability, the specific period when her response capacity would be most limited. That is the kind of detail that moves through social and professional networks, through family conversations, through the kind of planning discussions that happen between people who are close. Public records indicate that Google search data connected to the case shows searches for Nancy Guthrie's home address originating from the Tucson area beginning months before the disappearance. Subsequent searches included queries related to Savannah Guthrie's salary. That is a documented digital trail that investigators have confirmed they are following. It describes a research process, someone building a picture of the target and the financial resources associated with her family over an extended period before February 1st. The Bitcoin wallet to which the ransom was directed has remained dormant. The FBI, according to reporting, sent a small amount to it as a digital monitoring mechanism, watching for any activity that would reveal who controls the wallet and from what device or location. Nobody has touched it. The wallet remains silent. There are two explanations for that silence. The first is that the person controlling the wallet knows it is being monitored and is too experienced to make a move. The second is that the person controlling the wallet is not an experienced criminal operator, that they understand enough to set up a Bitcoin wallet, but not enough to use it in a way that evades the specific kind of monitoring the FBI deploys in exactly this scenario. Someone who understands the technology in theory but lacks the operational experience to navigate its forensic vulnerabilities. The distinction matters because it describes two different profiles. An experienced criminal enterprise goes dark and waits, then moves the funds through layers of obfuscation at a moment calculated to maximize safety. Someone with theoretical knowledge but limited criminal experience freezes, paralyzed by the awareness that every action carries risk they cannot fully calculate. A science educator understands how things work. They are trained to understand systems, causation, and technical mechanisms. They are not necessarily trained in the specific operational security practices of criminal cryptocurrency management. The January 23rd dress rehearsal video did something that significantly complicates the investigative challenge for whoever is responsible for Nancy's disappearance, regardless of who that turns out to be. Before that footage emerged, the entire alibi question for any suspect centered on a single window of time, the evening of January 31st into the early morning hours of February 1st. To account for one's whereabouts on one specific night is a manageable problem, particularly if arrangements had been made in advance. But the January 23rd footage creates a second date that investigators are now examining. Where was the person who walked that driveway in reverse on the night of January 23rd? What cell towers registered their phone? What cameras captured their vehicle? These are questions that the individual in question may not have prepared for, because on January 23rd, they did not know they were being recorded, they did not anticipate that the footage would surface, and they did not have a reason to construct a cover for that night in advance. Investigators conducting a cell tower analysis, pulling records for the towers covering the January 23rd location, and overlaying them against the devices detected in proximity to Nancy's home on February 1st, are looking for the signal that appears in both data sets. If any device associated with a person of interest appears at both locations on both dates, that is the kind of evidence that is exceptionally difficult to explain away in a courtroom. An alibi can be constructed for one night. Constructing an alibi for 2 nights separated by 9 days, when you did not know the second night was being watched, is a fundamentally different problem. The suspect wore a mask on Nancy's porch. They could not mask the signal from a phone in their pocket. This is the investigative dimension that the January 23rd footage opened that would not exist without it. Before that footage surfaced, Any reconstruction of the suspect's movements was anchored to a single night. Now there are 2 nights, 2 locations, 2 data sets for investigators to run against each other. The person who conducted that January 23rd test did not know they were building a second set of evidence against themselves. They went to a location they believed was safely distant. They conducted a test they believed would be invisible, and in doing so, they gave investigators something far more valuable than a single night's data: a pattern. 2 appearances, 9 days apart, in the same general geography, by the same individual. A pattern is not an anomaly. A pattern is a signal. Tower dump analysis in cases of this type produces records from every device that connected to relevant towers during the relevant windows. Investigators then do what is essentially a Venn diagram exercise: which devices appear in the first data set, which appear in the second, and which appear in both. The devices that appear in both sets are of primary interest. Among those, investigators look for devices associated with individuals who have other connections to the case. If a device belonging to someone with documented ties to Nancy Guthrie, to her family, or to anyone else of investigative interest appears in both sets, it creates a factual record of physical presence that transcends anything any witness or alibi can offer. Cell data does not forget. It does not get coached. It does not respond to the pressure of a high-profile case. It simply records what happened and where. We have now examined the full documented picture, the behavioral evidence from the porch footage, the January 23rd rehearsal, and what it tells us about preparation and discipline, the investigative actions taken at Annie and Tommaso's property, the questions about the timeline and who was last with Nancy, the DNA evidence and what it suggests about the number of people involved, the ransom, communications and what they imply about the knowledge and motivations of whoever sent them, and the digital trail that connects the January 23rd rehearsal to the February 1st abduction. There is one more thing worth addressing directly, because it has been raised by people following this case closely and it deserves a serious response rather than dismissal. The official clearance of the Guthrie family has been cited repeatedly as a reason to move the investigative conversation away from people close to Nancy. Sheriff Nanos said clearly that the family cooperated, provided access to their phones, computers, vehicles, and properties, and should be treated as victims. That statement is documented. It is real. It matters. It also exists alongside a documented investigative record that includes multiple returns to the same property, forensic examination of the septic system, vehicle impoundment, removal of security cameras, and extended neighbor interviews specifically about this couple. Both things are true simultaneously. The question of which of them is more operationally significant, the public statement of clearance or the documented pattern of investigative returns, is one that the evidence will ultimately answer. What the evidence will not answer is any question framed as a certainty before the forensic process is complete. The DNA analysis is ongoing. The cell tower data is being processed. The genealogy work is being done. The investigation is active. And the results of that work, when they come, will either confirm the questions this evidence raises or resolve them in a completely different direction. That is what it means to follow the evidence. Not to reach a conclusion before the evidence does, to lay out what is documented, what it suggests, and what questions it demands, and then wait for the evidence to deliver the answer that no amount of theory or speculation can substitute for. What do all of these things tell us? They tell us that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie required specific, intimate knowledge of her home, her routines, her security systems, and her family's financial structure. They tell us that the operation was planned over weeks, not days, and executed with a level of composure that reflects preparation rather than improvisation. They tell us that at least 2 DNA profiles are present in the evidence, suggesting more than one person may have been involved. And they tell us that investigators have repeatedly focused their attention on 2 people who were among the last to see Nancy alive, who lived 4 miles from her home, and whose property has been searched multiple times by federal investigators. They also tell us something important on the other side of the ledger. The DNA found at the scene does not match any family member. The suspect's height estimate from forensic analysis produces a measurement that some analysts believe does not match Tommaso Cioni's publicly documented physical profile. The sheriff publicly cleared the family. And the possibility of a stranger, someone with an obsessive fixation on Savannah Guthrie, someone who studied Nancy's home remotely and planned an approach over months, remains a live investigative theory that the physical evidence does not definitively exclude. Both of these pictures are built from documented, verified evidence. Both of them are incomplete, and the gap between them is exactly the space that the DNA analysis is designed to close. The forensic genealogy process, building family trees from partial DNA matches in available databases, tracing branches until they converge on a specific individual, has resolved cases that seemed impossible. It identified the Golden State Killer after decades of failed investigation. It identified the suspect in the Idaho student murders from evidence that conventional database searches had not matched. It works because DNA is specific in a way that disguises and personas and carefully constructed narratives are not. It does not respond to misdirection. It does not care about gear choices or behavioral performance or public statements. If the DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home and from the glove found along the potential exit route leads forensic analysts to a specific person, that person will have a name. And that name will either confirm what the circumstantial evidence suggests, or it will resolve this case in a completely different direction. Identifying a stranger, someone outside the family circle, someone whose presence in this case was not anticipated by any of the theories that have dominated the public conversation. The DNA does not care about theories. It does not care about coincidences or patterns or investigative actions. It will deliver a result that the investigation has been building toward since the first days. One that no misdirection, no disguise, no carefully crafted narrative can change. And we are closer to that result than most people following this case realize. Every element of this investigation has been presented based on official law enforcement statements, verified reporting from credible news organizations, and publicly documented evidence. The investigative questions raised here are grounded in documented facts, not speculation about any specific individual's guilt. Every person referenced in this video is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. That presumption is not a courtesy. It is the foundation of the system that will ultimately determine what happened to Nancy Guthrie. What this investigation demands is not a verdict on any individual. It demands answers for a family, answers for a woman who has been missing since February 1st, 2026, who has a pacemaker, who requires daily medication, and whose grandchildren are waiting for her to come home. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. The reward for information leading to her safe return or the arrest of those responsible exceeds $1 million. Anonymous tips can also be submitted to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Someone knows what happened on the night of January 31st into the early hours of February 1st, 2026. Someone knows where Nancy Guthrie is. Whether that someone is a stranger who has been hiding in the investigative blind spots, or someone who was standing in her kitchen 4 hours before she vanished, is the question that the evidence is in the process of answering. The DNA results are coming. When they do, they will tell a story that no performance can rewrite. If this investigation moved you, if this kind of serious, evidence-based analysis is what you come here for, subscribe to The Verdict Room right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we examine the evidence, follow the facts, and deliver the verdict. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is a community built on serious analysis. What does the documented evidence tell you? What questions do you think investigators are closest to answering? This is The Verdict Room. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. The evidence has spoken.